The fight for the space mission begins in his home world. Brock Rivers never wanted to be a repairman on Mars. Years ago, he failed to protect his family. Now he labors across a frontier planet to keep his children alive and escape Cause. Now he is summoned back to Earth for an impossible dream: to resist Cause, confront the secret adversaries among his own people, and to restore gospel missions in the 22nd century above the circle of Earth.
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
Welcome aboard and go therefore. This is Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven.com, where we explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I'm E. Stephen Burnett, the publisher of Lorehaven since 2018, and also the author of a new science fiction adventure novel now launched today, March the 4th, from Enclave Publishing, called Above the Circle of Earth.
Yeah, congratulations, Stephen. And I'm Zackary Russell, and I am the chief engineer of this podcast, and I am currently checking out the engine room of a cool new starship in front of me. This is episode 252. What if space missionaries fought the secular state? And you are our guest today, Stephen. You are the special guest and special author. Congrats.
I could get used to this, Zach. By the way, down there in Labor Deck, where there is access to the Stellarator and the fuel tanks and all of this, do not delve too greedily and too deeply. Don't open too many of those cabinets because, as we talked about in our soft science fiction episode with Clint Hall a few weeks ago, you're going to find just a lot of wires and blinky lights in there. I'm still trying to figure out exactly how this ship runs, but it does run, and now it has launched. Above the Circle of Earth is now available in hardcover, digital, and audiobook from the fine creative crew at Enclave Publishing. You know, I think I'll just go ahead and do the first sponsor for this episode, which is Enclave Publishing. This is a strange feeling, but the sponsor is Above the Circle of Earth with a back cover like so. His fight for the space mission begins in his homeworld. Brock Rivers never wanted to be a repairman on Mars. Years ago, he failed to protect his family. Now he labors across a frontier planet to keep his children alive and escape Cause. But the spacefaring humanist regime is taking over Martian colonies, forcing all to join the secular state. Back in their homeworld, Brock's people discover a way to fulfill his old dream. After decades of cultural isolation, they plan to restore missions for the 22nd century, voyaging beyond Earth to share the gospel in space. Brock must find a ship and recruit a team of misfit believers. They expect opposition from the formidable Cause, but not from a more deceptive enemy. One secret adversary attacks from the shadows to destroy the faithful. Others unify to oppose the project. Brock and his family must fight to resist these enemies of the space mission, or else return to exile forever. That is Above the Circle of Earth, authored by yours truly, releasing from Enclave Publishing today, March the 4th, and it is available in hardcover, in audiobook, and in digital form. You can get that from Amazon or 20% off retail for the hardcover edition at Enclave Publishing. See the spectacular notes in the show notes for this episode. The cover is there too. This episode is episode 252. Or for the entire podcast archive, go to lorehaven.com/podcast. Zach, we've been busy at Lorehaven and for me trying to prepare to launch this book. As you know, we already had the physical homeworld in-person launch party this past Saturday. And this evening, actually, if you're listening on release day, we're going to have the first of maybe a few off-world launch parties. I'm doing an Instagram live starting at 6 p.m. if the Lord wills. And then we'll also, I think, Zach going to do a live stream of some kind on Friday. Details TBD as we record, but watch this space for details. You can follow me on my social media at eStephenBurnett. This story's been a long time coming. As we'll talk about in a moment, this actually predates the entire Lorehaven project. I've been working on early versions of this off and on, even before I joined up with the original Speculative Faith website in 2006. In fact, if it weren't for the very early, arguably gross versions of this project, I probably wouldn't be here. That led to this, and then this leads back to that. So in celebration of this long-held mission, we're going to have a drawing next week for those who share this episode. If you share this podcast episode, tagging Lorehaven and tagging me, Stephen Burnett, we will enter you in our free drawing for an epic Above the Circle of Earth gift set. This will include, but not be limited to, a signed hardcover copy, bonus items, swag, pins, bookmarks, that sort of thing, a spaceship that you can build, and other things that I have not yet decided or retrieved the coupon codes for. So share this episode by the end of the day, this Friday, March the 7th, to be entered. But if you're a little late getting to this episode, I have a feeling I'll want to do more giveaways sometime this month in March. The next week, we will announce a winner for the episode that debuts Tuesday, March the 11th. Zach, I hope you weren't trying to get to Lorehaven.com on Wednesday last week, because in celebration of science fiction, even though I'm not about a robot dystopia, the bots overwhelmed the site. I don't know what happened. The AI got a lot out of control. I don't know what.
Yeah, Stephen, I got to take responsibility, because just like on the original Starship Enterprise, they had all these blinky lights and switches and no labels on everything, and somehow they just pushed all the right buttons, and it seemed totally random, but they absolutely knew what they were doing. And I got to confess, I don't always know what I'm doing here. I probably pushed a bunch of blinky buttons that crashed the Lorehaven ship. So
it's just
I apologize
buttons
for that.
They're just wired to watch batteries. They're not supposed to do anything. But then sometimes when we do something that feels a little hollow, it turns out to have some substance to it. So it is too with Lorehaven. The bots seem to be under control, and we may actually be running a bit of a tighter ship afterwards. So fingers crossed, God is good. And so at Lorehaven, you should, Lord willing, be able to get there to the site and look at all the awesome on-screen articles we've had. We had an early review of the House of David biblical fiction adventure drama that is directed by John Irwin, I believe his name is, and it's on Amazon Prime. I'm still looking forward to seeing this once
that looks
post-launch is underway.
Fantastic.
I was thrilled at Jeneth's praise of that series. It looks like Zack Snyder's Old Testament, and I am here for it.
Yeah, so that review is written by a new colleague of mine, Michael Allen. So I'm really glad to have him publish that guest article, and I really enjoy his movie reviews in general. He has a great YouTube channel for that. And yes, Jeneth, our very own graphic designer for Lorehaven, she's really had a lot to say kind of behind the scenes to us. But something really cool, Stephen, that she just shared this morning is that the main actor for David, in addition to being a very unapologetic Christian, is Broadway trained and is the actual singer of the songs, which I didn't realize there would be music in this, but of course there would be. We're talking about David, who wrote all the Psalms.
Literally wrote like 98% of Psalms. Now, what are the odds, Zach, that we get a fantastic performance for David for the Sight and Sound Theaters in Branson and Lancaster, Pennsylvania, who also plays the harp and sings his songs and does the action stuff and all of that. And then you get it all over again for more of a gritty retelling of the story, biblical fiction style, probably part of the Bible verse, honorary at least, going on in Amazon Prime. So this episode isn't even about that, but we're all about biblical heroes. And I saw an interview recently where a bunch of the actors were saying correctly that if it were not for the original narrative about King David, we probably would not have the hero's journey. It is literally the original classic hero's journey. And no wonder then that Christ himself, the son of David, has a life on earth that is very much like his famous ancestor. Jesus is reigning now, and yet he will be back, and he'll eventually be in Jerusalem and everything. So very cool. House of David, we're looking forward to it. Hey, Jeneth Lead wrote a review of the Gabriel and the Guardians. I'm not going to say Gabriel of the Galaxy or some such. It's Gabriel and the Guardians from that other streaming service. I think, that's not PureFlix. That's Angel Studios. This is an animated series with some top performers from Star Wars animated shows and Young Justice, and it's the animation studio that did Young Justice and X-Men 97. I won't recount the whole story here, but this looks spectacular, and I may need to check this out as well. And then we have A.D. Sheehan doing a review of a movie called The Gorge. Lord willing, that was out on Monday, if the bots allow. If the bots allow. Bad Christmas song. Okay, over at the main reviews, Shannon McDermott, author of The Time Door, which I reviewed, returned to the favor, but we only do like or love reviews at Lorehaven. So fortunately, she liked or loved Above the Circle of Earth. So that's her review at the site of my own book, carefully edited, because I am, after all, the site publisher. So we're taking precautions to make sure that those reviews are still objective. We've got another review coming out this Friday, but I've been a little busy with launch preparation, so that title is not in front of me now. If you're missing all of this, by the way, and you want to keep up, you can go to lorehaven.com every day. That's always recommended. We put everything on that amazing new front page. Or you can subscribe free to get updates, and then we will send you whatever you like, including the invitation code to join the Lorehaven Guild, our Castle in the Cloud at Discord. Our new book quest starts Monday, March 10th. We're going to give a little bit of a breathing room from this release date. And yes, that book quest will be about 3 weeks going through Above the Circle of Earth, but it's going to be led by a friend of mine, Elijah David. So Zach, from there, let's get started with the discussion. We're not going to spoil this book if we can help it, but I've broken this down into 3 chapters following the layout of a particular starship in the story. Starting with the command deck, let's talk about the hero's plot and ideas. And I have nothing written here. This is kind of new to me. So Zach, you're going to have to take the helm. And then I'll just try to sit in the passenger seat and be a good guest.
Well, let's start with the same question we ask all of our guests on this episode, which is, when did you receive Aslan into your heart?
Well, it was probably age 7, and I did not read Narnia right at the first try. By that, I don't mean that I read it in the dreaded chronological order, which is either a heresy or Eastern Orthodoxy, and therefore has no place. I'm just kidding, Eastern Orthodox. I'm just kidding. I know y'all like your Narnia in chronological order, and it's a denominational distinctive. But point being, I liked the parts on the Earth side of things where the humans would jump into Narnia, and then I was just too young to maybe appreciate the fantasy world. I just really liked the idea of that portal moment. And then I don't even remember what order I read them in originally. I hope it was publication order, like they came in my box set. But that's probably when I got on my knees and accepted Aslan. No, in all seriousness, I was already a Christian, and Narnia was but one of the formative influences for my love of fantastical stories. There was an animated series talked about hundreds of episodes ago now, Superbook, which had time-traveling children launching back through a spinning animated continuum to experience Bible stories. And then there was a flying house that was actually also a time machine, which I thought was extremely cool. So I've grown up always commingling biblical truth and fantasy / science fiction. Caught up with the other genres later, but as a homeschool kid, I obviously wanted to write my own stories. So once I moved on from my stuffed animal universe, I saw a pizza box. This is the origin. I had to trace it back. I saw a pizza box in 1999 with a certain prequel space hero. And I got this brilliant thought that could only occur to a homeschooled teenager who hadn't seen a lot of movies or read a whole lot of secular fiction at that point. Say, I know there's this thing called science fiction. I thought, but what if we had science fiction that's, for Christians? Gasp. What an extraordinary original thought. And one would say, based on the pizza box, a cheesy one. So it took a few decades. I hope, I don't know if one can ever arrive here, but it took a few decades to realize, if you're going to write science fiction, you ought to read more of it. You ought to watch more of it. You ought to enjoy more of it. You ought to understand where it came from, why it works. We'll talk more about that actually in our next episode next week, Zack. And I did develop a love for it, fortunately, and found favorites and discovered the differences in subgenres and all of that, while at the same time growing as best I could in the biblical doctrines of Christianity, getting all gospel centered in the mid 2000s and and yet also trying to understand why God gave us the ability to enjoy stories and our imaginations in the first place. So a lot of that goes into the Lorehaven origin too. But if it weren't for those twin interests in biblical truth and fantastic imagination, I wouldn't be here doing any of those.
Well, let's talk about kind of the big ideas of your story. Like, what's the plot? Who are the main characters? What are the kind of the corner pieces of the puzzle that you're assembling for us here?
A lot of that goes into that back cover, which, by the way, a lot of work goes into the back cover. Maybe 21 revisions total, and I'm including the ones that I did on my own. So if you're an aspiring author out there and you think you got your back cover on the first try, no, you didn't. You didn't. That thing has to be finely calculated. Otherwise, the fields do not align and you do not achieve zero gravity. That's the main description there. I'm trying to think of how else to expand on that without spoiling the plot. I will say that the story begins on Mars. So it's a good, familiar, unfamiliar human alien world for those who like their science fiction. And yet, just in case, this is a very Earth-centered story. In fact, the tagline there is the battle for the space mission begins in his home world. So before we go out, going therefore on our space mission, you've got to build the thing. This is the origin story of the space mission and the type of world that it's coming from, a potential future for Christians and anyone who believes any kind of religion. We'll talk more about that in chapter 2 about the world building here. But the big idea here is not so much, hey, guys, you got to be a missionary. That's a foregone conclusion, right? Like the story is not going to argue with you, hey, guys, you should believe in God. Hey, guys, you should, respond to the altar call. We're on the inside about the people who are saying those things. The big idea is, how can you do that? How can you go on this glorious mission to which Christ has called you while also protecting your people? And that's something that everyone struggles with, whether or not they believe in God, although this is definitely a story that's mainly by Christians for Christians. I will limit the audience there because it's something I think Christians deeply understand, but it's a deeply human impulse of wanting to do something great, wanting to go exploring, but also having a family to protect. I used to hear pastors in the mid 2000s say, well, yeah, I've got a wife and family and all that, but I think God is calling me to the inner city. So we're going to sacrifice everything and move to the inner city. And I thought, props to you. It's wonderful to have that zeal, but what about your family? 1 Timothy 3 says you've got to take care of your family. You got to protect them. And yet the Bible also says to go to dangerous places to share the gospel. So how to reconcile the tension? I don't know if Brock and Alicia Rivers find the answer at the end of this story, but they certainly move a little closer to it. And through making this story, I feel like I've moved a little closer to that resolution myself.
Well, it does seem a lot more dangerous to go into orbit or other planets than to go to a closed country because not only the system of persecution or whatever can affect you, but the environment itself could kill you from one mistake with a hatch or getting hit by a micrometeoroid or something. So they're definitely not playing it safe from what you've told me. But I want to ask you about this phrase from the back cover, really from our title, so Space Missionaries. So are they going into space to evangelize the aliens, Stephen, that we all know are circling around the Earth right now in their UFOs?
Well, we all know they're circling there, and the news about that is going to come out any day, just like the Epstein files.
Right.
Can you imagine all of those pundits now fleeing out of the White House, holding up their binders with the X files written on them, and then we open it up and there's just a bunch of shrug emojis
Psych.
in there. Yeah, psych. So no, this Above the Circle of Earth and its universe is a human-centered story. So this is near future, close to home science fiction. There's some fantastical technologies in here, some that were originally speculative, but now have come to life. We could talk more about that in later chapters, but others are still very much further out in the future, very speculative. Synthetic gravity, nuclear fusion, things like that. I even have some quantum vaulting in here. It's a mainly way to move people from point A to point B without taking a lot of months getting to those locations and bogging down the pace of the narrative. So fantastical stuff happens here. but it is certainly earthbound, very, very, very earth focused. And we are talking about the types of people, Christians and otherwise, that we would meet now in the world around us, although projected forward 100 years, which I was happy to discover is a science fiction tradition, even going back to Star Trek, which kind of went over the top with, oh, well, this alien race represents the Russians and this one represents the Americans. And it gets a little heavy handed. So we try not to do that. But this is more about the types of personalities, at least in this first story. Cause is the enemy. Cause is the secular state that has effectively barred Christians and others from sharing or living out their faith in the public domains. You have to live in a preserve, a special legal district, in order to have your freedoms. You can go outside, you can engage in trade, but all that religious stuff, that's got to stay in the confines of your preserve. So, Zach, you referred to that previously as balkanization. And in hindsight, that seems to be maybe the least worst option that Christians and believers in other religions may have if the secular state takes over. One of the challenges, too, of this story is making clear that CAUSE, the Coalition for Advancement of United Space Exploration, they are villains, but they do great things. I mean, how can you not admire these technologies that these very skilled and smart humanists have put together? Just like one could admire the science fiction that humanist authors like Isaac Asimov have given us, or Arthur C. Clarke. Like, there's some really fascinating concepts that they've dealt with. The philosophy, that sense of grandeur, and then maybe even occasionally a memorable human character. But the Circle of Earth wants to kind of split the difference. So we want you to feel those big ideas and get into those debates about how missions could work in a world like this. But this is very much a human-centered story. You've got the family, the Rivers family, right there on the cover, and I'm pleased to say they put them on the back cover as well. Just another glimpse of them in silhouette. And so that tells you at once, even though there's a big spaceship looming on the cover too, that tells you at once this is a human journey that just happens to involve spaceships.
So you mentioned it's human-centered while it explores how missions could work. So this is a story that is directly about missionaries. So it's almost like a missionary biography. I've read your early drafts of this. I've got an early copy of the finished book, and I'm working my way through that. And
yeah, Amazon jumped the gun there. Props to everybody who ordered early and then you got to take advantage of a loophole that you didn't even know about.
Yeah. So I guess I want to know, why did you want to write about missionaries?
Well, I wanted to write about Christian characters, not because I'm a Christian and because the best stories have Christians in them, but because I found that with some exceptions, the Christian-made fiction that I enjoyed growing up was supposedly geared toward non-believers. Non-believers, at least in the era that I grew up in, it's probably different now. Non-believers were the main characters, or lapsed Christians, or backsliders, because there's this persistent idea. We've talked about this at Lorehaven all the time, Zach, is that the best kinds of Christian stories are going to be evangelistic. You got to get an altar call in there somewhere. Somebody's got to get a gospel presentation, or really, what was this all about? Counterintuitively, this story about Christians who are missionaries is not trying to get the reader saved. It's more about the journey to try to get others saved and how hard that can be. The persecution you face, the consequences of your own dumb actions, questions from your own people, challenges that are really hard to deal with. Do you make rational arguments? Do you blame other people? Do you attempt to reason with them? And then what happens when somebody out there starts blowing stuff up? Now, hopefully, most Christian missionaries now don't have to deal with sabotage like that. But it's very representative, I'm sure, of the kinds of struggles that Christians in that job will face. So it was just a natural jump for me to realize, okay, we're not talking about just plain Christians. We're talking about Christians who want to do missions. But in one way, like if you go to Matthew 28, every Christian is called to be a missionary of some kind. Jesus gives that commandment, go therefore and teach the nations, baptizing them, discipling them, for lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. That call goes out to not just the apostles, but to all believers. Zach, you do this professionally, of course, which is fantastic. And you know a lot of people who do. And yet I'm being made aware, not just because the bots are swarming my server, and I've had some other attacks, maybe, I don't know. In this past week, I'm made aware all over again. Oh yeah, every Christian is a minister in a sense. Every Christian is an evangelist. Now, some are better at it than others, and some get paid to do it full time, more or less, and have to raise their support. But all Christians ultimately ought to be always on to share the gospel, whether or not you're getting to the point about Jesus dying on the cross. One way or another, we're preaching bits of the gospel as we go. One way or another, we are missionaries, whether it's on earth or someday beyond earth.
Stephen, a lot of what you've talked about reminds me of William Carey, famous missionary to India. And a lot of what he spoke about at the time was like a defense of missions to the British people. It's been a little while since I've read this. I'm kind of trying to de-rust my brain cells. But this was back in the 18th century. So, what, 400 years before Brock Rivers goes out into space. And he had this treatise, I guess you could call it. It's called An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens. Very chunky title there. So let's break it down. He was facing a church culture that I guess thought the Great Commission would just sort of happen by itself.
Very Calvinist, very err on the side of predestination. My dear Mr. Carey, if the Lord wants to save the heathens, he will do it without your help. That's how they talked back then.
Right. So it's really funny to look back on that period of church history because, yes, as a missionary now, I use means. I raise support to be in ministry like many others that do this and have for generations now. And it's not unusual in our church culture for this to happen. I mean, everyone's been to a church where a missionary's got up and spoken, here's how you can donate to them, or we just take up an offering for missions, or, any number of things. We get solicitations in the mail or by email. We're all kind of used to this, but a few hundred years ago, there was a real resistance to that in church culture. And it's so strange, Stephen, to think about this, right? Because this is the 18th century when that happened. So 1800 years, roughly, after Christ gave the Great Commission to his disciples. And, the Apostle Paul is collecting offerings for other churches, and he's having to be a tent maker at times because donations were getting low. He wasn't full-time a tent maker missionary. He was trying to be full-time a missionary, and it didn't always work. But the point is that missionaries had been going out for, 1800 years. And then all of a sudden we get to this church culture where they're like, I don't think we really need to take an offering or even send missionaries. I think it'll just happen. And so William Carey has to really address this. And so you writing a story about church culture 100 years from now, where we're basically back to this 18th century culture, it's not too far of a stretch to me, really, that the church could kind of drift in this way. And maybe not the whole church, but maybe the church in America, or maybe whatever, the Western Hemisphere. Was something like that what inspired this world where people have kind of forgotten about missions?
Oh, in part, certainly. I grew up like a good homeschool kid, reading missionary biographies. And I don't even remember specifics. I remember the names. I remember where they were. I remember the general era, and with a little refresher, I can remember details like William Carey. William Carey actually gets name checked a couple of times in Above the Circle of Earth. And there's a few other shout outs to some famous missionaries of yore. And yet, it's not an educational book. Those who are interested can go look at those real world missionary biographies. The challenge here is celebrating those who are called to do this work without trying to act like we're persuading people to do it. I think that'll happen naturally. This is not meant to motivate missions. It is a novel. It's a story. And I think it's my attempt to maybe, Stephen, don't say deconstruct. It's my attempt to look at a little deeper at some of the tropes that Christians can have about missions. Like we can lionize them maybe a little too much, when they show up at your church, showing the slides. And then maybe we forget that it takes some really, really deep sacrifices to do this. And sometimes one of the hardest things, I'm sure, is just working with other Christians. Not just because you're asking them for money, but Zack, you probably know more about that than I would. And, tact would dictate that we don't go into that now. But
I don't have to go into sordid details, but when I first joined ministry, they told us the number one reason missionaries leave the mission field is other missionaries.
Wow. Well, this is a story that is almost about that, but not quite. I've said before, like I want to celebrate Christians and all of their weirdness. You're going to meet a lot of weird Christians in this story, and some normal ones, and some ones who are kind of transitioning. And it's fun. And we'll talk about that more in chapter 2. But because it is a human focused story, I wanted to capture as best I could what are the kind of personalities you're going to find across the different types of Christians, and even some different denominations or coded denominations or just flavors of personality. And that was the most fun part of writing the story. And I got to say, it actually comes out a little bit more in the audiobook when you can hear our narrator doing the various characterizations. Like, okay, I can now start to see these people even more than I saw them when they were on the page and in many, many draft forms. I'll get to that in chapter 2. First, however, sponsor 2, switching from spaceships to medieval fantasy. This sponsor is Squire of Truth by Jill Williamson from our friends at Sunrise Publishing. Cole has journeyed far from his days as a stray stable boy in a distant mountain village. Haunted by failures on the battlefield, he seeks solace in music. But when the songstress he spent a fleeting evening with shows up at his doorstep, Cole may have gotten more than he asked for. Amidst the turmoil of a looming royal wedding and the threat of dark magic, Cole and Mistel must unravel the mystery of a brutal murder before they become the next targets in a deadly game of power. Return to the world of Eretz in Squire of Truth, a murder mystery romantasy from award-winning author Jill Williamson, and the first installment in the epic Blood of Kings Legends series. Got an update for this one too. Readers can now pre-order the next 2 books in this series with the co-authors of Jill Williamson. Book 2, Lord of Winter, releases in April, so just next month. And then book 3, Lady of Shadows, releases in July. But those ebooks will release a month early at sunrisepublishing.com. So go there and learn more. We'll have the link in our show notes for this episode 252, or go to lorehaven.com/podcast. Zack, we spent some time on the command deck. That is the top level of the ship where all the executive decisions are made. There's a high bridge. There are low bridges for internal and external affairs, as well as access to the galley and some other ship functions. But if we move below deck, we get to the living deck of the ship, Alpha Omega. And here, let's talk about the people, the dialogue, and the details of this story. I do want to start out here and address the villains a little bit more. There's some villains I can't talk about, but the titular villain is Cause. Now, Cause is basically, if you're a Christian and you've ever talked about how the humanists are taking over or we're moving into a negative world and it's all going to be run by atheists or secularists, this is that. And even more challenging to faithful Christians in this era, they're not doing that bad of a job. Things are actually pretty cool. This is not a dystopian story. It's not utopian. It's not dystopian either. Cause has not taken over all the nations. It's more of a United Nations in space type thing. So kind of a familiar trope in science fiction. The difference is that other religions do persist. They didn't just dwindle away like they will in some other science fiction universes, presumably, leaving just default humanity in its place. Cause, however, is aiming for that future. Turns out that in the future, they still write science fiction. So Cause has governed space exploration into Earth's solar system, going out as far as the Saturnine system as of the year of this story, 2125. So what happens on Earth? Well, after the last war, and all the balkanization that resulted, plus a lot of blame on Christians and other religions for egging the thing on with our daggum culture wars, we saw the One Humanity Accords that brought about the religious preserve system. So if you're moving to a faith community to be around other Christians and have your own private Christian schools and churches all in one place, maybe a 15-minute walkable city, who knows, then that becomes your preserve. You can file with your state or nation and just set one up. And then gradually those who don't want to be part of a preserve will move out. Those who do want to be will move in, and you have your legal limits established. And hey, presto, you've got what seems to be a good solution to living in a world ruled by secular humanism. Other religions continue, whether you're Islam or Catholic or evangelical or whatever. But out there in the world, in the public space, that is for humanism. And like I said, they're doing a good job because after all, they're making these amazing technologies that literally defy gravity and enable moon mining and all these other wonders. There's just one exception. Well, you could do a foolish decision and end up entangled with the city government that requires you to move to Mars to escape the consequences. But even then, the problem is you can't share your faith outside the world. You're perfectly safe from them, from those dastardly secularists. But A, aren't you kind of maybe in disobedience to Jesus, who said to go therefore anyway? And B, they're not getting saved. They're lost out there. These are people doing all these amazing things, and yet they don't know the God who gave them the gift of science and imagination. So our heroes, somewhat like me, although with very different perspectives here and there, they want to resist the preserve system as well as protect their families. Can they do it? How can they do it? That remains to be seen.
So it's interesting you wrote about this, Stephen. Yeah, you mentioned the term earlier, balkanization. And there are quite a number of people today that are actually pushing for this, that they think the solution to all of the polarization in our country and a lot of, just intractable disagreements between the left and the right is to kind of split everyone up into these little politically aligned enclaves and or even religiously aligned things. And, you hear the term national divorce kind of thrown around a lot now. A lot of this was kind of pre 2024 election. I haven't heard as much since then, but a couple of things that I've been tracking throughout this. So I think it was last year, there's a group called New Founding that wanted to build this thing called the Highland Rim Project in Appalachia. And it's these basically conservative Christian little towns and neighborhoods, planned communities. And then here in Texas, there is a development underway called Epic City. It's people call it a Sharia city. It's 400 acres, including a mosque, housing, schools, clinics, stores, parks, and nursing home. So in a way, a little bit more of a developed idea than the Highland Rim project. You can find out on your own how these are covered in the news. But the point being that there are groups already today making moves to sort of do this. And actually, we already saw this several years ago now in Seattle. We saw the CHAZ development, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or the CHOP, or whatever it was. And similar thing happened in Minneapolis. And so, look, we've had fiction about this now for a couple of years. We've had The Purge. We've had Man in the High Castle. We've had a number of stories that kind of imagine what if America, but different? What if America, but not one nation under God, and not a United States, but a very divided states, and not even states anymore, but sort of these kind of feudal societies. And I think there's a lot of well-meaning people that think, oh, wouldn't that be nice if I could just know all my neighbors and not deal with all the baloney that's happening out there? People trying to stop me from practicing my religion or try to influence my kids. And if I could just kind of just nestle away in one of these little mountain areas. Well, look, in general, there's really nothing wrong about that. It's not like everyone needs to live in a city. I mean, in some ways, I think you have to be a little crazy to live in a city. I think the natural thing is to live in the land and live where you know your neighbors and you're not just an anonymous taxpayer. But I think this idea of balkanizing ourselves could go really bad. And I like how you explore that. So tell me what's kind of the basic result, good and bad, of the preserve system in your book?
One of the best results is that the cultural Christian problem is basically done away with. The social costs are too high for you to just hang around Christians or churches and act like you're a Christian. Why would you do that? There's barely any advantage in the top secular realms right now of doing that. So why would you do that in the future? When preserves are basically marginalized. If you live in a preserve and someone out in the world meets you, or arranging a trade or something, maybe you got them some nice produce, it's not, they're not going to be hostile against you. They're just going to think you're kind of weird. And it's going to be a very awkward interaction. So there's a few of those in this story. It's not like, Left Behind times where you got to get the mark of the cause or you don't buy or sell. No, you can trade with people, but you certainly can't build a Christian university in the middle of a secular space. That's the normal world. Why would you want to do that? That's preserve stuff. Go back to your preserve and build it there. So there's some pros and cons right there. It's limited freedom, but also flourishing all at once. So that's the challenge for me, because I was listening to the audiobook version and listening to the president of Circle, which is the main organization, the main Christian organization of the story right now. And he's talking to guests of the preserve about the advantages of the preserve. And he's actually talking about the disadvantages as well. So he'll address all of that, I think, in chapter 9. But I'm hearing the advantages. And even though I wrote this, I'm thinking that actually sounds pretty good right now. I'd love to go to a place that's basically a walkable city where everybody has high standards of virtue. And really, if you're not a member of some kind of local church in good standing, then what are you even doing here? Churches can't afford not to practice healthy church discipline. Certainly their outreach efforts have dried up. It's all internal discipleship. So you're going to face stagnation in other ways. And you're definitely going to face some problems with insularity. Like many Christians and preserves are just blithely unaware of what goes on out in the world. Certain technologies or news will scare them. You'll run into some conspiracy personalities. It's kind of strange, Zach. I really started revising this in earnest about, I'd say, blimey, was it 8 or 9 years ago? And so a lot of this has actually kind of come true in a lot of ways, and yet I don't want to, this is not a story that, man, the American church is bad. We need to stop being bad. You know me, I can't stand those generalizations. I want to be more about the people. Where are they coming from? What are their hopes and dreams? What are they concerned about? What experiences have informed their drive toward mission? Like, for example, I've already talked about Brock and Alicia Rivers at length, and they have 3 kids, by the way. Don't tell anyone, but they had 2 extra kids when they went to Mars, and we really don't want that getting out. There are other characters, though. At least one of the viewpoint characters is Jason Cruz, who I don't want to do a whole lot of spoilers here, but he's ex-military. He spent some time in the secular world. He did come from a preserve in New York State, but this was not a good preserve. This may be actually one of the worst side effects of the preserve system is, y'all, if you think the cults and the false religious movements are bad now, you should see what happens when there's even fewer eyes on them. And they're literally hiding out in the hills, putting their cults together and doing all the usual cult leader stuff. Jason has to get out of that. And yet he's left some very precious friends and family behind. And so that informs his drive toward missions from a very different angle. And there's other people who come aboard the ship eventually, a little later in the story, who come from all kinds of different traditions and perspectives. And seeing how that plays out, if we ever get more stories in this world, we don't know if we will. I'm just saying, if we ever do, that's going to be probably the most fun part of it. It's just exploring these different personalities. And that's going to help me too respect the diverse lot that God has put into biblical Christian churches.
Yeah, a lot of what you've described is very similar to the underground church in China, and a lot of the attitudes there of Christians, because it's not really acceptable to be a Christian there unless you belong to the official Free Self Patriotic Movement church, which is directly controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And often, first of all, it makes a lot of theological compromises. And then it's not exactly friendly towards underground churches. So to belong to an underground church, it's like you said, Stephen, why would you do that unless you're all in? You're not going to risk, your reputation being damaged, your freedoms being taken away, possibly your life being taken away, unless you really mean it. And so that is one of the positive things, or at least positive outcomes, not the positive intention, is that the church there is very strong and very dedicated, and they are sending missionaries themselves to countries that are very hard for Americans to get into. And so you do see how God works at that. And so kind of what you're describing here in your book, it's like, I like that there's, God is still a character in this. Like there's God's sovereignty over the preserve system over cause. And at the same time, we're seeing, as you said, people that don't have the best experiences with this. And so it's not all, sunshine and rainbows in these preserve systems. This reminds me, though, Stephen, of another movie that one of my favorites called Surrogates with Bruce Willis. And in this world, everyone walks around virtually through these lifelike androids. And so they stay in their homes, they put on their VR goggles, and they just pilot around these humanoid things from the comfort of their homes. And so there's basically no more crime or no more disease, no more whatever. And except there's a lot of humans that don't want to go along with this. And so they live in these, I forget what they call them, but these like reservations basically, and all over the US. And so, and you go into these reservations and it's very grungy, it's sort of like they're in the past a little bit. It's very cyberpunk in that way, but at the same time, they're living a much more fulfilled life. And you see that the people using surrogates are living these very empty lives. In that world, like, I don't think people intended to live in these human colonies. It's like, well, the technology and the politics kind of forced us into this. And so I pick up on that a little bit in your book that, yes, people are thankful for Circle and the preserves, but they realize that, society did not quite go in the direction that we wanted. And so there's sort of this underlying discomfort with that and discontentment with that. And so I see that as a lot of the motivating factor of your characters. They're like, we should be able to be Christians everywhere and take Christianity anywhere that God would send us.
Well, there's a lot of emphasis too, especially in the opening chapters, on simple love for one's neighbor. Brock is in a situation where he has to try to save the lives of people in a specific place on Mars. And yet the one thing he can't really do, even though he will be left alone by cause if he keeps to himself on Mars, the one thing he can't do with other people is give them the gospel. Like, they're literally in the face of death. And like, if he does that, his career is over. It literally is over. And if your career is over on Mars, it's not that easy to switch to another career. You're going to run out of oxygen first. And he's got a wife and 3 kids to feed. So that's going to be the challenge all throughout. And even if you're not in a dystopian order. But speaking of which, our third sponsor is new. J.R.R. Webb, who's written a novel called Fragments, and it's going to move into the Seekers series. The world ended, but its masters remained. Okay, so switch continuities here. This is not my 2158. This is J.R.R. Webb's 2158. The year is 2158. Civilization has collapsed, but from the ashes, the order has emerged. Not as a savior, but as the unseen power that has ruled all along. Truth is a relic, dissent is a death sentence, and Fragments by J.R.R. Webb is a gripping tale of power, deception, and the courage to seek truth. Perfect for fans of dystopian thrillers like 1984, Brave New World, and The Da Vinci Code, but with a Christian twist. If you like stories of faith, defiance, and the battle against unseen tyranny, you will love Fragments, book 1 of the Seekers series from J.R.R. Webb. You can see that spectacular dystopian cover in the show notes for this episode 252. Get the purchase links too, or for all the archive, go to lorehaven.com/podcast. Zack, chapter 3, we got time to talk a little world building, a little writing craft for all you writers who are like, reveal your secrets. Like, I have none to reveal, folks. I just got here. Ask me in a few years when maybe I'll be 10% of an expert. But one thing I will say I've enjoyed so much about this story has been the research. And I've mentioned some of the technology, but because this is a very human-centered story, my philosophy is to keep the technology running quietly down here on the labor deck. The labor deck is the lowest level of the ship. You should only go down there if something is wrong, or if you're especially trained for it, or if you're a nerd. So for all the nerds who are down here on labor deck, it has been special fun researching how you write science fiction. Like we talked about this some, even Zack, in the soft sci-fi episode. I really got to link that in the show notes because basically a prequel of this one by accident. But there's some stories that dwell overlong on the tech and exactly how the spaceship spins and what the G-forces are and how long you can keep it running on this speculative energy source. I want to do just enough of that homework to ground the story in speculative reality, but I want to stay up with the people. And that's an audience consideration as well as playing to my strengths. I'm more interested in the people than the tech, but the tech is pretty cool too. And some examples of tech that literally our real world has caught up with is AI agents. I have some in these stories. You don't, but it's not an AI story. That doesn't take over. It's not the dominant technological thing you have to fight. It's just running in the background all the time, presumably on quantum computers. You don't even call it AI. It's just an agent. Or you have AI operating nanoparticles that are called specs. They're sentient specs, meaning they are nanoparticles powered by artificial intelligence, and they're just running in the background. They're what's coming out of the clip you put on your nose in order to give you wearable computing. They're in the tags you put on your ears to have an always-on sound system for the Vox network. Specs are crawling around the outside of your spaceship doing micro repairs to meteorite damage. Like, it's a nanotech world as well as some other technologies like fusion reactors. And I've gotten to research some of what are the speculative propulsion systems we could get? What are the signs in nuclear fusion? How long have they been able to sustain fusion in a lab somewhere? By what approximate year could we tip over? And when it's actually affordable, it'll actually get you more energy than the materials you put into it. Some of that stuff gets really, really fascinating. And then, one thing, reality eclipse the story, is voice cloning. There's actually a really notable voice cloning example later on in the story, AI voice cloning. And now it's real. And so when it started to become real, I thought, am I going to have to change this? I don't know how to change this. It's a pivotal moment. And so what you do then is similar to what Star Trek did with genetics tampering, is you realize, well, the world's going to get there. But if you do that, it will only go in terrible directions. So you're just going to have everybody get together and agree to ban it, because otherwise that issue just takes over the story. Same with the sexual revolution. That's barely a part of the story, because if the sexual revolution and the identity emphasis that we've condemned so many times here, if you get that into the story, it just takes over and it becomes an agenda book, even if you're the right agenda. And who wants that? So we just have to sideline that as part of the world building, along with some other technological excesses, in order to keep things focused. But one of the world building things I love too was trying to figure out some of the Martian stuff. We only spend like a few chapters on Mars and then hopping back and forth once or twice. We'll go there again someday, maybe, Lord willing. But if we do, then I've got a bunch of stuff laid out. There's 2 Martian calendars. I've flied around the surface of the planet with the apps that JPL and some others have. People have put together ideas about time zones. You can, if you know where to look, plot exactly where Mars is going to be daylight and nighttime at a particular point in the real world's future. So if I did my job right, all that lines up in the story. If somebody on Earth at midnight at this date in the future looks up and sees a full moon, unless it's cloudy that day, he will actually see a full moon if he stood there in real life. And then if you jump to Mars in the next scene and it's 7 a.m. in the morning, well, it really will be 7 a.m. in the morning at that geographic location on Mars.
Well, it sounds like some of the technology that's plaguing us today went back into Pandora's box for your book, and so that's kind of interesting to hear that.
Sometimes you can stuff it back in there if you really try.
I wonder about the voice cloning thing. Like I had an opportunity to use a voice cloning thing recently, and I'm like, no, I don't really want to do that because I don't want my voice living on some AI system. And maybe it's like kind of a superstition. It's like, if I give my voice to this AI, am I going to give away part of my soul? Yeah, but then it occurred to me, Stephen, we do a podcast every week. My voice is being clearly recorded, and I'm sure I've hit every sound in the alphabet. And I'm sure someone could take that and make a voice clone of me. And
Don't
I'm not
give them ideas.
Suggesting that people do that. Please do not do that.
Everyone, I have converted to Mormonism. Jesus and Lucifer were brothers. Also, I am an atheist.
Yeah, so that it is pretty scary what can happen there. So don't believe the other Zacks that you might hear out there. But Stephen, here's my question. Does someone need to be a sci-fi nerd to enjoy your book?
It's probably going to give you an advantage, but I've heard from some people who were not well, they're probably trying to read it because they know me and love me, and that's really great. And all respect to them. Short answer is I don't know. Now, I know I was interested in this story before I was a sci-fi nerd, but this was a very early version of the story, and it was probably terrible. So I'm not quite sure how to answer this question. Maybe if you mind if I do the political thing and answer the question I wish you'd asked, is this a hard science fiction book? I'm actually going to try to issue some clarity about that. Yes and no. Yes, because there's some hard sci-fi behind it. Like all the dates need to line up. I want to know how stuff works as much as I can. And yet there's speculative stuff, but it's largely based on real theories that are happening right now. So that's pretty typical for medium sci-fi, like hard/soft sci-fi. I'd say it's hard sci-fi with padded corners because it is very much about the human.
Well, it was kind of a trick question because I don't think so. The science and technology in this book are not the focus. So
they're running on labor deck quietly.
Yeah, the science is not the main character from what I can tell. But I'll tell you what I really liked in one of the earlier chapters. It's where the Christian characters are debating whether Christians should adopt a certain technology, in this case, the quantum jumping, sort of like the interplanetary teleporter is essentially what it is. And it's kind of interesting from thinking about this in the future. It's like, okay, they're already living in a future where there are spaceships and artificial gravity. And they're like, can we do teleporting? I don't know. That may be one step beyond what we're comfortable with. And yet they've already adopted all these other things. And I just think that that's so true to Christians that we do this, right? We take a lot of time, and people often we make fun of ourselves that, oh, Christians are always 5 years behind. Well, I think it's that we don't want to just rush into every new technology like it's going to save us. We want to see, is this actually going to help further the health and the mission of the church? Or as someone say, will this promote human flourishing? I've kind of gotten a little tired of that phrase for other reasons, but is this a good technology for us, or is it going to dehumanize us? You including that in your book, I thought was actually really true to how we all know that we are. And I would not call your book a hard science novel. I would call it a hard Christianity novel for that reason.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, maybe we should have used that in the marketing. It's a hard choices. Like there's no easy choices when you're in a world like this, when you're being besieged from without and from within. And for example, if you're going to a place to look for a new spaceship, do you bring a weapon? Should missionaries carry weapons?
Yeah.
Is the context depending? There's a whole lot of those discussions too, and not for the last time. By the way, no easy answers. I don't know them either because I believe in self-defense, but at the same time, if you're a missionary, the rules change a little bit depending where you are. You are not there to take over with your guns. You are there to share the gospel, and if necessary, give up your life if they don't like it. When does that tip over? When does the Apostle Paul get tired of being whooped and say, hey, I'm a Roman citizen, by the way, psych, and then freak everybody out? It's Paul doing all things for the sake of his calling to spread the gospel. And so that really is about. But Paul also can kind of go places that my families can't because they have kids. And the Apostle Paul, as far as we know, did not. So that's what the Apostle Paul said, it might be a good idea to do this work while you're single. So how does it work when you have a family?
Well, and that's a fantastic question. It's one I think about a lot, especially as I consider going to a lot of places overseas that there are not very many churches or Christians, let's say. But yeah, that question about self-defense as a missionary or even as a Christian, man, I mean, okay, here in Texas, we got, 3 or 4 times as many guns as people. So we're very much a gun culture here. And this is a conversation among a lot of Texas Christians like, hey, is it okay to, have a gun or use self-defense in this situation or that situation? We debate this constantly, and no less because of other great stories and true stories like End of the Spear. I haven't read the book, but I read the movie. It's based on Jim Elliot and Nate Saint, a group of missionaries that were tragically killed in South America by the tribal people. And there's this moment where they could have fought back because they had guns. And they chose instead to use their guns to try to scare away the attackers, but not harm them. So basically, they just shot the gun into the air. And, there's this scene where that really bothers one of the tribal guys. And he's like, he could have killed me. Why did he didn't kill me? And it's revealed later, Nate Saint had told his son, his son had asked him, like, are you going to use your gun? And he's like, no, they're not ready for heaven yet, son. And man, that really sticks with me. So I appreciate that you are diving into those questions, because it's hard theology or hard Christianity. It's like, these are the actual things that Christians debate, and we're going to embrace all that in this book. It's not a generic Christian, generic spiritual characters where you can just kind of see yourself. It's like, oh, these are very specific things that we actually talk about.
Absolutely. And while I could say a whole pile of spoilers here, but they may be outdated in 5 or so years, depending on what happens to this. This is a standalone science fiction, by the way. There's no other books that we're threatening you with right now or anything like that. Franchises like that, you keep up with the Thomas Umstattd verse. It's like, hey, trilogies are out. People don't want to get snookered into a series that either ends badly or does not end at all. So for the present time, this is a one and done. Of course, I've got ideas for more. Everybody in my place would have ideas for more. There's a lot of places this story can go, but really the call to action here is go get Above the Circle of Earth in hardcover, digital, or audiobook. And then if you like it, review it. Reach out, ask for more if you want to, or just say, you know what, I'm good. I'm good with this one. And then that'll help me and those I'm working with determine where we go from here. But right now, this is the single story. Really hope you enjoy it. Above the Circle of Earth from our friends at Enclave Publishing.
Well, to you, our listener, we want to know, would you like to be an astronaut one day, or would you rather be a missionary on Earth, or would you want to be an astronaut and a missionary, or would you want to live in a preserved system like we've talked about? So send us a note to podcast@lorehaven.com, or share this episode on social media. As Stephen said, you could get a free copy and some other swag. Send your comment there. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and X. And now we want to go to some comments that we got from previous episodes. So for episode 250, about the God of Story with Daniel Schwabauer, Andrew Swearingen said he felt ambushed and said, quote, "This episode snuck up on me. I wasn't expecting to be quite so affected by it, but it really hits a lot of my doubts that I've had as a creative person trying to find my place in the world and, if I'm honest, the church. Great episode and can't wait to read the book." Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I hear you, man. It's to be in this sort of in between, this kind of liminal space, as they say, of you're a creative, but you're not of the world. You're not just aping everything that the world makes, but you're in the church, and a lot of times churches don't know what to do with creativity and fantastical stories, and so you're welcome here. You're very much welcome here, and we're glad you enjoy that talk with Daniel, and definitely check out Daniel Schwabauer's book, The God of Story. We also heard from Jordan Taylor, who listened to that episode and shared his thoughts on his favorite translation. Quote, "Howdy, I've been listening to this podcast since the 2020 pandemic. Woo! And have been blessed ever since." And side note, I'm woohooing for a longtime listener, not the pandemic, of course. Okay. He says, "In the past, my favorite Bible translation was the New Living Translation. It was the first translation that I ever read from and really opened my eyes to Scripture. From there, I've dabbled in the NIV 1984 and 2011, ESV, NKJV, NASB, and CSB. Currently, my favorite translation for daily reading is the NIV 2011 because it feels like I'm reading a novel. Fun fact, the Lord of the Rings trilogy inspired me to read the ESV Bible for a time because they both sound similar. Thanks, Tolkien." To the second question, my reading of the Bible has motivated me to start reading historical fiction that takes place in biblical, medieval, and or Greco-Roman time periods. End quote.
Well, appreciate that from you there, Jordan. By the way, Above the Circle of Earth trivia, by the year 2125, 100 years from now, a lot of Christians favor the NESV. So imagine there's lots of debates over that one. By the way, on that same episode, wow, that one fetched a lot of conversation, Zach, along with the Vibe Shift one. We don't even have time for all the comments here, but Joel Crumbly said he found good fiction in the Bible. He said, quote, "Love this week's episode. Just want to chime in and say that the ESV is the only way to go." So we are dividing the church, by the way, Zach, with our translation preferences here. Joel goes on, also in terms of Christian fiction in the Bible, I wanted to note that when Jesus says, I am the vine, I believe that this is a great example of Christian fiction. It isn't true in one sense that he is a literal vine. So does that mean Jesus lied? No. On a deeper level, a more real level, you could say, he was telling the truth, and it gave us an image of who he is better than if he had just said, I am the source of your life, and you must maintain a constant connection to me to truly do good works in this world, because as I flow through you, you'll flow into life that looks more and more like mine. Yeah, I agree with you there, Joel. Jesus did the TLDR version that cut straight to the quick of imagination, building in similes there much better than I attempted right there with, I think, something about a fingernail in the simile. Anyway, Joel goes on, when we write or read fiction, I believe it should follow this model, speaking a direct and deep truth about life or God without needing to state it directly. True stories are always an image of God because he has a monopoly on truth. Appreciate that from you, Joel. We also got a lot of comments about the Vibe Shift episode, but I think we'll save those for our next episode, along with any feedback for this episode, if we get it. Definitely share this episode. We're getting a lot more traffic at Lorehaven. Maybe it's because we cleared out the bots. Maybe it's just time to get more traffic. I don't know. Maybe it's the book. I don't know. But hopefully you'll recommend this podcast, Fantastical Truth, to a friend and share this episode this week by Friday. And you may also get your own copy of Above the Circle of Earth, signed and everything, along with the aforementioned swag. Next on Fantastical Truth, we are now in Martian month. Next, we're going to talk about the planet Mars, named after the Roman/Greek god of war, fourth from our sun. It's a frigid desert with gravity 38% the level of Earth and many secrets lurking in its frozen rocks. Maybe ice, maybe old microbes, you never know. Either way, this world looms large in the public imagination thanks in part to the many fantastical stories that orbit this alien land. From princesses and Tharks to the inspiration for Arrakis, and from high fantasy and hard sci-fi, how and why does this crimson circle shine bright in our skies? Look to the skies this week. You may see all 8 planets still hanging out, but even if 1 or 2 have moved below the horizon, the psalmist said, when I consider the heavens, the work of your hands, he's led to conclude that man is nothing. What is man that you're mindful of him? The son of man that you care for him, the psalmist asks. And I think that Christ answers, I made the stars, I made all the planets, I made you with the ability to make stuff to go see them someday. And in the meantime, to make stories that help us visit them by proxy. So either way, whether it's on Earth or someday among the stars, go therefore, evangelize Mars as we keep seeking and finding Christ's fantastical truth.